In the heart of the underworld, a global empire of crime was born, stretching across borders and oceans, merging the cunning of the Sicilian-American Mafia, the raw power of the Mexican syndicates, and the relentless ambitions of Colombian cartels. This is the world of the real-life Narcos. A story of alliances, betrayals, and empires forged on the narcotics trade. The Colombian cartels held the keys to a kingdom of white gold, cocaine. From the streets of Colombia to the blood-stained ports of Havana, shipments were quietly split, repackaged, and slipped onto smaller loads to outsmart relentless agents. As each gram crossed the line, the American Mafia reveled in the staggering profits, facing little real threat from the still-developing narcotics division. It wasn't until the 1950s that the world's agencies, particularly Interpol, began to take serious notice, organizing across Europe to combat these growing syndicates. But by then, the Mafia's roots were already deep and tangled across continents. Our story opens in Sicily, Italy, during the darkest days of war and repression. Vito Genovese, the infamous Mafia strategist, had escaped to Italy, hiding under the protection of Mussolini's regime. Through Italy's fascist machinery, Genovese spun webs, creating trafficking routes that would later define an entire era of organized crime. When Mussolini fell, the Americans swept into Italy, installing governments that functioned like mafia fronts, quietly directed from the shadows. And in Sicily, former mafiosi slipped into official roles, building a bridge between Genovese's criminal network and powerful elements in military intelligence. Here, in this volatile land, the alliance between Genovese, the Mafia, OSS, which later turned into the CIA and naval intelligence, took form. The shadowy influence of the military ran deep. Through Luciano, who had secured a powerful agreement with US naval intelligence during his time in New York, the Mafia began to intersect with intelligence networks, accessing the darkest corners of Europe. Where the Americans faced resistance, gangsters slipped through. And in time, Vito Genovese was smuggling heroin on behalf of the American Mafia, setting the stage for the US to dabble with allies in unexpected places. With the specter of World War II looming, American soldiers filled Italian streets, watching the devastating toll of combat. Many, disillusioned by the hardships they witnessed and the empty promises of cushy posts, became players in the narcotics trade themselves. The Italian recruits especially, paid nearly nothing for risking their lives, faced a choice: turn a blind eye or partake. Some chose the latter, and narcotics poured into every crevice of Europe and beyond, paving the way for traffickers in uniform. In the turbulent 1940s, justice almost claimed Genovese. Yet through the intervention of powerful allies like Frank Costello and Lucky Luciano, Genovese slipped through the judicial cracks. When deported, he managed to beat his case and walk free, a living testament to the Mafia's reach. Soon, the American intelligence apparatus realized the potential of a partnership with criminal elements, profitable and convenient. As the Office of Strategic Services morphed into the CIA, new figures entered the game, and no one loomed larger than Alan Dulles. With Dulles at the helm, the Mafia gained unexpected allies. In a new era of espionage and narcotics, the lines between government, gangsters, and global traffickers blurred. The legacy Genovese built, trafficking routes, allies in high places, and narcotics pipelines, fueled an unstoppable narcotics machine, forging an unholy alliance that would define the underworld for decades to come. The art of smuggling transformed into a finely tuned operation when the Volstead Act ignited the underworld's thirst for illegal profits. Smugglers from around the globe quickly organized, establishing hubs and networks that would change the face of crime forever. They needed a reliable point of origin, and soon whiskey from Scotland, as well as from Ireland, and alcohols from across Europe, South America as well as Asia began pouring into strategic rendezvous points. Islands like Cuba and Newfoundland became invaluable outposts, taken over by organized crime groups who saw them as crucial gateways for circumventing the law. Corruption seeped into the ranks of dock workers, who ensured shipments slipped through unnoticed, circumventing Coast Guard patrols. In this new criminal enterprise, fast boats called skiffs raced through the 3-mile limit to offload booze, evading the authorities. As Frank Costello eventually stepped back from smuggling, especially after Prohibition ended, the tactics remained. Smugglers began adapting these methods, shifting from bootlegged alcohol to untaxed goods, and later to cocaine. Dumping narcotics just outside the 3-mile limit, they used sleek speedboats to shuttle the contraband to shore in an operation refined and expanded with each passing year. When Costello faded from the smuggling scene, his meticulously crafted routes were adopted by shadowy crime figures who turned these paths to darker uses. New bosses seized the reins, evolving the smuggling lanes for human and narcotics trafficking, perfecting Costello's legacy into a sinister empire of their own. With Prohibition's repeal in 1933, Santo Trafficante Sr. saw a fresh opportunity, not in booze, but in narcotics. Using his Bolita racket connections in Cuba, he traveled to Havana and forged powerful alliances. Two key figures, Indalecio Pertierra, a congressman who ran the exclusive Jockey Club, and Senator Paco Prio, brother to Cuba's future president, became invaluable allies. In 1945, Pertierra co-founded Aerovías Q, a Cuban airline designed as the Mafia's private channel, cleverly avoiding customs scrutiny. According to Cuban author Enrique Cirules, this airline made regular weekly flights between Havana, Camagüey, Barranquilla, and Bogotá, facilitating a lucrative cocaine pipeline straight to Santo Trafficante Sr. The contacts in Camagüey were an essential link, moving shipments through an under-the-radar network that funneled narcotics to Havana. These drugs flooded into America, and they were handed to men like Carlos Marcello and Silver Dollar Sam, whose outfit ran like a well-oiled machine, distributing the illicit cargo through cities like Detroit and across the southern states. While Luciano, through Vito Genovese and Genovese's associates, were just beginning to explore the narcotics trade, it was the Southern Mafia, especially Santo Trafficante Sr. and the New Orleans crime families, who were the established giants, entrenched in narcotics for years. These were the real heavyweights, a syndicate able to source from every corner of the world, pulling in supply from Mexican, Italian, and Colombian traffickers, and even from Asia and Guatemala. This deep involvement in the drug trade became the cornerstone of their empire, fueling a criminal expansion that included sprawling gambling enterprises and desert casinos. The Southern Mafia's dominance in narcotics gave them not only the wealth to build empires, but also the power to buy influence, swinging elections and securing politicians in their pocket. Their grip stretched far and wide, touching every corner of the South. The reach of this trafficking empire extended to states like Arkansas, where cocaine arrived by air. Pilots would fly in from the Gulf Coast, dropping loads onto private lands whose owners were part of the scheme. These local accomplices would retrieve the cocaine, keeping the operation nearly invisible to authorities, making it notoriously hard to intercept shipments or stop the flow. This was the Southern Mafia's strength, a web so well hidden, so deeply entrenched, that it became almost untouchable, leaving authorities scrambling to catch up. By the 1950s, amid the Korean War, the US government turned a blind eye, or worse, lent its support, to Korean factions involved in narcotics. Agencies like naval intelligence became entangled in the drug trade, seeking to exert influence and shape foreign allegiances. Guatemala also became a hotspot, where drugs flowed through ports in New Orleans and fanned out across the United States. One man, Carlos Marcello, wielded exceptional power, leveraging his connections with the Central Intelligence Agency and Guatemalan officials. After the coup d'état, Marcello's influence flourished, with his network extending from fisheries to full-scale narcotics trafficking, a sophisticated machine that only expanded with each passing year. In the shadowed corridors of power, the CIA, naval intelligence, and other branches of the US government wove themselves into the web of narcotics trafficking, a dark partnership hidden for decades. It was the early 1950s when whispers first emerged, but the American public remained unaware of the vast reach of organized crime. Narcotics agents, like Henry Anslinger, along with persistent newspaper headlines, cried out that a national syndicate, the Mafia, was deeply entangled in gambling and narcotics. Yet their warnings were ignored, as figures like J. Edgar Hoover and other officials dismissed these men as relics of the Prohibition era. The likes of Costello, Marcello, and others were dismissed as nothing more than gambling czars. But this was a smokescreen. These relics controlled every city, every industry, and almost every corner of the American economy. From unions to banking cartels, they funneled billions back into legitimate businesses like Hollywood, music, hotels, and casinos, all while expanding their grip on narcotics. Their influence ran so deep that it wasn't just the Italian-American Mafia at work. It was a syndicate of syndicates: the Sicilian Mafia, Corsican Mafia, Cuban mob, and even British banking cartels. Together, these forces forged an empire, rebuilding lost fortunes from the Second World War with drug money as their capital. With no DEA to check them, this criminal empire grew unchecked, amassing billions. Drug money flowed into election coffers, buying politicians and dictating policy. But by 1957, cracks began to form. A self-inflicted blow would soon expose these men. That year, the Appalachian meeting, a mob summit meant to stay under wraps, was raided, and the true scope of organized crime's power was laid bare. J. Edgar Hoover, along with the FBI and other agencies, was caught red-faced, while Anslinger and his narcotics agents were vindicated. Organized crime wasn't just in gambling or unions. It was running narcotics on a global scale, with the very men at that fateful meeting among the heaviest hitters in heroin smuggling. The 1960 presidential campaign marked a new chapter. John F. Kennedy faced off against Richard Nixon, and the Mafia found itself at a crossroads. Nixon had strong Mafia support, but Joseph Kennedy, father to John, reached out, ensuring the mob's backing for his son. Heavyweights in organized crime threw their weight behind Kennedy, swayed by promises from Joseph Kennedy Sr. But the Kennedys underestimated the forces they were courting. The men who had helped elevate them to the presidency were the same ones who could destroy them. Organized crime's grip on America had reached into the highest ranks, corrupting police commissioners, naval intelligence, IRS agents, and even narcotics agents, all used to eliminate rivals. Another war brewed beneath the surface, a war for funding. Intelligence agencies vied for dominance, lining up before Congress and senators, each lobbying for a bigger slice of the budget pie. The CIA, FBI, naval intelligence all demanded greater funds to fuel their covert operations. But as congressional scrutiny tightened and public oversight increased, these agencies began finding ways around the watchful eye of Washington. In a shadowy alliance, some factions turned to organized crime, siphoning profits from narcotics operations to fund their clandestine activities without the hassle of congressional approval. They funneled drug money into covert programs, bypassing the American people and the legal processes altogether. It was a system built on the currency of corruption, as these agencies expanded their power, not through official channels, but through an unholy partnership with the underworld, using the narcotics trade as a backdoor source of revenue. This underground economy became the lifeline for secret missions, a war chest funded by vice and violence, hidden in the shadows. The CIA intertwined with the Mafia, particularly through their efforts in Cuba, leaned on these connections in their bid to stop Fidel Castro and halt communism's spread through South America, Africa, and beyond. The Corsican Mafia and the New Orleans Mafia, meanwhile, became a tool in the CIA's fight against communism in parts of Africa. As John Kennedy took the White House, he, alongside Robert Kennedy, unknowingly began to confront the very system that held the country in its grip. Corruption bound America's power structures, and the Kennedys, by exposing this corruption, were about to unravel a dangerous network. By November 22, 1963, the resistance came to a bloody end with Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, a turning point in the war on organized crime. In the years that followed, organized crime regained a measure of freedom, but the exposure from Appalachian and beyond left an indelible mark. The world now saw them as mafiosi, and legitimate business doors began to close. By the late 1970s, the narcotics trade, once hidden in shadows, came under relentless scrutiny. By 1979, investigative reports from outlets like the Arizona Republic exposed the mafia's fingerprints from Arizona to Chicago, Mexico to Long Island, Harlem to Montreal, unveiling just how deeply entwined organized crime was with every facet of American life. Arizona's estimated 22,000 heroin addicts are a major factor in the state's consistently high ranking in national statistics for crimes against property, such as thefts and burglaries, law enforcement authorities concede. At $50 per day, Arizona addicts would spend $1,100,000 daily, or $400 million annually, on heroin. To put this in perspective, that amount exceeds the annual Phoenix City budget of $345 million. The Chicago Syndicate has long had influence in Mexico, a relationship dating back to the days when Sam Giancana, the deceased former head of the syndicate, resided in Cuernavaca, Morelos, for several years. Giancana was shot to death in 1975 in the basement of his suburban Chicago home. One of the syndicate's prominent heroin go-between was Arden Lee Smith, a former burglar who estimated he dispatched a half-ton of heroin across the border from his opulent Mazatlan, Sinaloa, home before he was imprisoned at Arizona State Prison in 1977. Law enforcement authorities say the heroin went to syndicate figures such as Tony Spilotro and Frank Pedote. Other Chicago figures involved in heroin trafficking include Joseph LaPiccolo, who authorities say has ties to Joseph Bonanno Sr. of Tucson, and Theodore Lawler, who is currently facing bank robbery charges. However, the Mexico connection with Chicago has not been limited to those with Italian surnames. Some of the largest trafficking organizations are Mexican groups. The Herrera organization, which authorities estimate includes around 1,000 individuals, is composed of Mexicans from its point of origin in the state of Durango through its major delivery point in Chicago. The organization suffered a minor setback when its leader, Jaime Herrera, was arrested recently in Mexico. But sources in both Mexico and the United States say he is still able to exert control. Authorities claim there are two other Mexican-controlled organizations bringing narcotics into Chicago that rival the size of the Herrera group. California is also heavily involved in the Mexico connection, with figures spanning from the San Francisco Bay Area down through San Diego. They include the Giannone brothers, Ronald and Emil, a pair of San Francisco narcotics and arms traffickers linked to the Carrito group of San Jose, according to law enforcement officials. In Los Angeles, the Mexico connection includes Edward Zuba, who law enforcement agents know is involved in importing heroin and cocaine. Zuba's associates have included syndicate heavyweights Meyer Lansky, recognized as the Mafia's financial wizard, and Florida Mafia figure Santos Traficante. Narcotics authorities identify Salvatore Pizzello of Los Angeles as a narcotics dealer connected to the Gambino family of New York. Among organized crime figures in the United States with ties to Mexico is New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello, whose territory includes parts of Texas as well as Louisiana. Among the Texas mobsters Marcello has controlled, federal authorities say, is Frank Zambito, a United States fugitive believed to reside in Tampico, Tamaulipas. Zambito has been heavily involved in narcotics trafficking, according to authorities. Trafficante, from his base in Tampa, Florida, appears to dictate mob policy for the southeastern United States in conjunction with Marcello. Federal spokesmen report that Trafficante, like Marcello, has been deeply involved in narcotics. Other Florida figures in the Mexico connection, authorities say, include Sam Cagnina, a federal fugitive sought on conspiracy charges, and Lansky. Lansky, who is associated with both Marcello and Trafficante, was observed at a meeting of top organized crime figures in Acapulco, Guerrero, in 1970. Trafficante and Lansky had previously worked together in Havana before Fidel Castro took control of Cuba. Today, federal authorities claim they maintain gambling and other interests at various points in the Caribbean. Of the 5 traditional New York crime families, federal sources name the Gambino, Lucchese, and Bonanno organizations as the most active in the Mexico connection. The Gambino family has had the largest presence. Family members with ties to Mexico include Charles Alimo, Vincent Beltempo, Edward Lino, and Joseph Stassi. Other New York traffickers involved in the Mexico connection have included Joseph Di Palermo, Paul Oddo, and Guido Penosi. The Cotroni organization of Montreal, which played a major role in establishing the French connection from Marseille through Montreal in the days when Turkey was the main supplier of heroin to the United States, also developed a connection with Mexico, according to authorities. The organization brought white heroin through Mexico City with the assistance of Italian nationals residing in that city. Federal officials in New York report that the trend has shifted in the past year from heavy use of brown heroin back to white. The current source is Southeast Asia. A leading narcotics official in New York, the capital of heroin use in the United States, said brown heroin was virtually unknown in New York until around 1974. By 1975-1976, the heroin entering the city was almost exclusively brown, but white heroin began reappearing in 1977. Today, white heroin accounts for much more of the total than brown. United States Drug Enforcement Administration authorities say that despite the magnitude of the problem, heroin use is declining in the country. They also report that a smaller proportion of heroin is now coming from Mexico than 3 years ago, when 90% of the heroin entering the United States originated there. Authorities now estimate the figure to be around 56%. Law enforcement officials note that they are continually frustrated in their efforts to imprison major traffickers because over time these criminals have become adept at insulating themselves from situations that could lead to prosecution. Furthermore, prosecutors point out that the slow pace of the justice system in this country often allows major offenders to remain free on bond for as long as 3 years while they exhaust their appeals. Every major mobster in the United States has a counterpart in Mexico. Among the leading Mexican traffickers are Manuel Salcido Uzueta, a violent heroin trafficker from the historic narcotics hub of Sinaloa. A federal fugitive in Mexico, Salcido spends most of his time in the Sierra Madre, where he maintains an extensive organization. Salvador Chavez Najera, a major supplier of heroin in the Southwest, whose imprisonment in Tijuana, Baja California, has not curbed his trafficking activities, according to narcotics authorities. Gil Caro Rodriguez, a veteran of 10 years of heroin and marijuana trafficking, whose network of contacts spans Guadalajara, Jalisco, and Tucson. Enrique Diaz Garcia, the leader of an organization based in Durango State that, like the Herrera Group, handles heroin from the poppy fields straight to the marketplace in Chicago. Jose Terran Torres, who has been a federal fugitive in Mexico for 5 years. Narcotics authorities say he deals in multi-kilogram quantities of heroin and tons of marijuana. Jorge Favela Escobosa, one of the old guards from the Culiacan, Sinaloa area. Favela's organization traffics heroin and cocaine into the United States through the Tijuana, Baja California area. Alberto Cecilia Falcon, a Cuban-born trafficker who, despite having been imprisoned in Mexico City for 3 years, has managed to continue running his large-scale trafficking organization. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, considered the main mover of cocaine through Mexico to the United States. Authorities report that he has connections in the San Diego area. The traffic of fugitives goes both ways. One of the largest heroin traffickers in northern Mexico is now a fugitive from that country, living in Arizona. He is José Luis Contreras Subias, who has taken up residence in Tucson. Convicted on narcotics conspiracy charges, he is currently awaiting retrial after a ruling that narcotics agents suppressed evidence in his case. The law has proven to be a minor impediment to many major narcotics traffickers in Arizona, 99% of whom deal in Mexican heroin. Take the case of John Gordon Sabari, arrested a dozen times in the past 20 years for alleged forgery, robbery, and narcotics offenses. Sabari, now 40 years old, was profiled as a major Mexican heroin trafficker in a section on organized crime published by the Arizona Republic in June 1978. 6 months before that publication, drug peddling charges against him were dismissed because 2 government witnesses failed to testify. Sabari remains in business today, as big as ever, dealing Mexican brown heroin to the black community along West Buckeye Road and to the West Coast, according to law enforcement authorities. The same situation applies to longtime Sabari associate Freddie McWilliams, also known as Bubba and Blue, authorities say. Like Sabari, McWilliams, now 38, escaped prosecution 17 months ago when government witnesses refused to testify. McWilliams, a former state middleweight boxing champion, has a record of burglary and narcotics arrests going back 20 years. McWilliams continues to deal Mexican heroin, according to the police. Traces of the narcotic were found on McWilliams during a recent search, but no charges were brought against him. Law enforcement officials at various levels report that the list of Mexican brown heroin peddlers supplying Arizona's estimated 22,000 heroin addicts continues to grow. Many of the major peddlers have long criminal records in the state. Jose Calderon, a significant dealer to the Phoenix Mexican-American population, is out and dealing, say narcotics authorities. Calderon has a history of violent and narcotics-related criminal activity spanning nearly 30 years. Shorty Gomez is also back on the streets and dealing. Shorty is Gilbert Mata Gomez, who was sentenced in 1975 to 10 years in prison for heroin distribution. Gomez primarily supplies the valley's substantial Mexican-American population. He has been a source of supply for former Tolleson Mayor Albert Celedon, who was also sentenced to 10 years in prison for distributing heroin. Celedon, too, is back and dealing, according to narcotics authorities. Abe Size, now 44 years old, is another trafficker out and dealing. Size has a 20-year record of arrests for alleged burglary, robbery, and narcotics dealing, and continues to sell heroin, according to police. His clients are also predominantly from the Mexican-American community. In Tucson, the pattern is much the same. Henry Duarte Yanez, sentenced 2 years ago to 15 years in prison for conspiracy to distribute heroin, remains out on appeal. Yanez, 37, continues to deal in Mexican brown heroin, according to authorities. Another long-time Tucson heroin dealer, still active according to narcotics authorities, is Hector Ma Wong, a restaurateur from Nogales, Sonora. Wong was recently sentenced to 6 months in prison and fined $9,000 for 6 violations of firearms laws in the United States. Ordered by a federal judge to post a $25,000 appeal bond and to remain in the United States, Wong fled to Mexico and returned to narcotics trafficking, according to sources. However, narcotics authorities say the primary heroin dealer in Tucson is a relative newcomer to the scene. In contrast to Wong, who fled to Mexico to evade authorities, this dealer, José Luis Contreras Subias, fled to the United States to escape Mexican authorities. Contreras Subias, also known as Leonardo Subias González, is a 33-year-old Mexican national who has taken up residence in Tucson. Law enforcement authorities describe him as a wild man. He is alleged to have killed 3 people and kidnapped a federal prosecutor in Mexico, where he is wanted on narcotics and homicide charges. He has similarly shown little regard for the law in the United States. Last year, Pima County grand jury indictments charging Contreras Subias with armed robbery and kidnapping were dropped when a key witness declined to testify. He was convicted in federal court last year on narcotics conspiracy charges and sentenced to 10 years in prison for plotting to smuggle 12 tons of marijuana and 200 pounds of cocaine into the United States from Panama. A new trial is pending on the charges after a federal court ruled that narcotics agents had suppressed evidence that could have led to an acquittal. A favorite photograph of Contreras Subias shows him posed in a Nogales brothel with the handle of an automatic pistol sticking out from his belt. He came out of nowhere in the past 3 or 4 years, a source said, describing Contreras Subias as a violent individual who rules by intimidation and employs henchmen to back up his bravado. Tucson authorities suggest he may be extradited to Mexico to face charges there once prosecution in the United States is complete. Contreras Subias appears to be a worthy successor to a major supplier to Arizona and the United States, who, 10 months ago, was stopped at mid-career by the Mexican Federal Judicial Police. That supplier was Pedro Aviles Perez, who was killed in a gun battle near Culiacan by Mexican police. At the time of his death, Aviles Perez was regarded as the second most powerful narcotics trafficker in Mexico, second only to Jaime Herrera Nevarez and his organization in Durango State. Manuel Samaniego Meraz, a long-time narcotics supplier to Arizona from the border area, remains active, according to narcotics authorities. Samaniego Meraz is perhaps best known to Arizona law enforcement personnel for the sophistication of his electronic equipment. He had better radio equipment than we did, one narcotics officer lamented. Most major heroin traffickers in Arizona are well known to law enforcement authorities, but successfully prosecuting them is another matter. Officials note that the longer a suspect deal in narcotics, the more adept they become at insulating themselves from prosecution. Mike Hawkins, United States Attorney for Arizona, explained that another difficulty faced by law enforcement is that it takes 3 years for a defendant in a typical case to exhaust appeal procedures. In the meantime, the defendant is often free to continue their activities. Hawkins noted that prosecutors plan to use the Continuing Criminal Enterprise statute more extensively. This statute provides for lifetime parole for major narcotics offenders. Pursuing a career he began more than 10 years ago, John Gordon Sabari continues to peddle heroin in Phoenix, primarily to the black community in the areas of West Buckeye Road and East Broadway Road, according to narcotics authorities. Sabari, now 41 years old, has been arrested a dozen times since 1956 for offenses including forgery, burglary, and narcotics dealing. Narcotics charges against him were dismissed last year after key witnesses declined to testify. His known associates include Abaddon Says and Freddie McWilliams. Freddie McWilliams. Like his close associate, John Gordon Sabari, Freddie McWilliams began as a safe burglar before transitioning into narcotics trafficking. McWilliams, now 38, was arrested 14 times for burglary between 1959 and 1969. In 1977, he was arrested during a massive roundup of major narcotics traffickers by the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration but charges were dropped when government witnesses refused to testify. McWilliams primarily deals in the West Buckeye Road area, according to authorities. Jose Angel Calderon. Jose Angel Calderon, 56, has a record of narcotics and other criminal activity spanning a quarter of a century. He served 6 months in prison for a narcotics violation in 1954. In 1956, he was sentenced to 3 years to life in prison for rape and robbery. Calderon pleaded guilty to a cocaine charge in 1976 and was sentenced to 1 year in prison. He primarily deals with Phoenix's large Mexican-American population, according to authorities. Abaddon Saiz, now 44 years old, has a criminal record in the Phoenix area dating back about 20 years. His offences follow the usual pattern of burglary, robbery, and narcotics-related charges. Like many other major narcotics traffickers in the state, Saiz has proven much harder to convict than to arrest. On 2 occasions, charges were dismissed after key witnesses declined to testify. One of these witnesses was later found in a shallow grave. Law enforcement authorities say Saiz uses a group of lieutenants to peddle narcotics, primarily to the Mexican-American community. Henry Duarte Yanez. Although sentenced 2 years ago to 15 years in prison for conspiracy to distribute heroin, Henry Duarte Yanez remains free on appeal. Narcotics authorities say Yanez, now 37 of Tucson, has not allowed his pending sentence to deter his narcotics trafficking activities. Yanez has been identified by narcotics authorities as the central figure in a ring shipping heroin to Phoenix and the San Francisco area. Jose Luis Contreras Subias. Jose Luis Contreras Subias, 33, exemplifies a type more commonly seen in Mexico than in the United States. The wild man heroin trafficker. Wanted in Mexico on narcotics and homicide charges, where he is alleged to have kidnapped a federal prosecutor and killed 3 people, Contreras Subias moved his operations to Tucson. Charges of armed robbery and kidnapping against him in Tucson were dismissed after a key witness declined to testify. He is currently facing a retrial on narcotics conspiracy charges in Tucson. Trying to get a handle on heroin trafficking in Mexico is like navigating a labyrinth, a theme often explored by Latin American authors. It is an exercise in distinguishing substance from shadow, truth from falsehood, and reality from appearance. Certain facts seem to be agreed upon by all, both Mexican officials and observers in the United States. For instance, there is little dispute over the success of Mexico's eradication campaign against opium poppy fields. Other claims, however, do not align as well. Mexican officials contend that they have dismantled most of the significant Mexican trafficking organizations that were operating just a few years ago. Yet reporters for the Arizona Republic discovered that many major traffickers in Mexico have been fugitives for years. Despite their fugitive status, in true macho fashion, most parade around openly with armed retinues. The term skulk does not seem to apply to them. Furthermore, reporters received reports of prisoners continuing to deal in narcotics during their so-called confinement. For some, the term confinement appears to be a misnomer. Jaime Herrera, a leading contender for the title of Mexico's top heroin trafficker, is reportedly released nightly from his prison cell, according to a reliable source. Another source, long familiar with the narcotics scene in Mexico, put it bluntly. They're serious about the eradication program. They're not serious when it comes to dealing with major offenders. In gathering information about heroin trafficking in Mexico, reporters interviewed Mexico's 2 top federal officials in narcotics control, Samuel Alba Leyva, Deputy Attorney General in charge of narcotics control, and General Raúl Mendiolea Cerechero, head of the Mexican Federal Judicial Police. These agencies are the Mexican equivalents of the United States Drug Enforcement Administration and the FBI. When asked about the eradication program during an interview in his office at the Federal Law Enforcement Building in downtown Mexico City, Alba Leyva provided statistics showing that crops in 70,000 opium poppy fields were eradicated from November 1976 through November 1978, with an additional 16,752 fields destroyed from December 1978 through May 1979. The data also indicated that the size of the fields may be shrinking. The average size of the 47,063 fields destroyed from November 1976 through November 1977 was 1,984 square meters, or roughly half an acre. By contrast, the 23,484 fields eradicated between December 1977 and November 1978 averaged 775 square meters, while the 16,752 fields destroyed from December 1978 through May 1979 averaged just 387 square meters, about 1/10 of an acre. The government's eradication program has driven many growers from the traditional cultivation areas along the Sierra Madre Occidental in Sinaloa and neighboring states to new, equally remote locations in southern states such as Chiapas, Hidalgo, and Veracruz. Alba-Leyva then shifted the conversation to the topic of apprehending major traffickers, about which he was equally enthusiastic. He stated that of the 15 major traffickers operating 2 years ago, 11 are now in jail, 2 are dead, and 2 remain fugitives. When asked to name them, he cited Roberto Beltran Felix, Jorge Favela, and Jaime Herrera as being incarcerated, and Pedro Aviles as among the deceased. He could not recall the names of the others. The people financing the operations 2 years ago are no longer in business, he said. Of the major traffickers studied by the Arizona Republic, more than 1/3 were fugitives. On average, they had been fugitives for 3 years, with 2 having been on the run for more than 5 years. Success in combating these traffickers has not come without cost. Alba-Leyva noted that 15 federal police officers have been killed in the past 2 years, including 2 just 2 weeks before the interview. After the interview concluded, Alba-Leyva ushered the reporters out and returned to his office. It was well past 9 in the evening. Meeting General Mendiolea was a different matter. Reporters were summoned one morning to his office, located in the same building as Alba-Leyva's, only to be questioned by a lieutenant. After hearing their reasons for seeking an interview with the general, the lieutenant informed them that they would have to return later, as the general was on a mission south of Mexico City. Reporters later learned that Mendiolea was overseeing an investigation into the slayings of 2 of his agents. Near the end of their stay in Mexico City, the reporters received a phone call at their hotel, several miles from the federal offices. "If you want to see the general, be at the office in 20 minutes. The cab driver, spurred by the promise of extra pesos, cut through the notorious Mexico City traffic, delivering them to the federal building in time. After waiting for more than an hour, the reporters were escorted into General Mendiolea's office. The general, a short, stocky, balding septuagenarian, sat behind a massive desk on a polished parquet floor. 11 phones of various colors sat on a table behind him. His desk was piled with papers, and an aide held the edges of the papers as the general signed them. Mendiolea's approach was different from Alba-Leyva's. He did not offer a handshake or a seat. Instead, he demanded credentials. He did not grant an interview so much as expound between his official duties. He spoke of the great cooperation between his office and the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, the thousands of fields of marijuana and opium poppies that had been destroyed, and the traffickers who had been driven out of business. Although his manner was different from Alba-Leyva's, the message was the same. Cooperation between the United States and Mexico is strong. The eradication campaign has been successful, and major traffickers are being taken down in droves. Much of what the General and the Deputy Attorney General said is corroborated by United States narcotics authorities. They report that the proportion of heroin originating from the traditional growing areas in the Sierra Madre Occidental in Sinaloa and neighboring states has dropped significantly, from about 65% to 40%. The reduction in poppy cultivation has also reduced violence in Culiacan, a city of 170,000 people in the heart of the traditional growing area. Narcotics authorities note that in 1977 there were 500 homicides in Culiacan, one for every 340 residents. Many of these deaths resulted from shootouts on major thoroughfares. It's still kind of a base. There are a lot of contacts to be made there, one observer said of Culiacan. However, the growing areas have shifted dramatically. The current breakdown, authorities say, is approximately 40% in the Sierra Madre Occidental, 10% in the Sierra Madre del Sur in Michoacán and Guerrero, 40% in the jungles of Chiapas, 7% in the state of Hidalgo, and 3% in the state of Veracruz. Operations centers also seem to be shifting. Much of the heroin traffic now flows through Guadalajara, which is beginning to overshadow better-known hubs like Culiacan and Durango. Opium poppies are cultivated in extremely remote areas, accessible only on foot or by air. 1 hectare, about 2.5 acres, can produce enough opium gum to yield a kilogram, or 2.2 pounds, of crude heroin. For that 2.2 pounds, a farmer can earn $4,500. A couple hundred grams, about half a pound, can bring in quite a bit of money, one source noted. In the hills, a few $100s is a fortune. When it's time to score the opium bulbs and extract the gum, a process that must be completed within about 2 days, many women and children assist in the harvest. How do these farmers called gomeros, derived from goma, the Spanish word for gum, become involved in cultivating such a lethal crop? You're talking about people who grew up in log cabins, one law enforcement official remarked. They don't know what a city looks like. They have no education. It's not that they're immoral. The concept of morality doesn't apply. It has no meaning to them. There is no point of reference. Major trafficking organizations often make agreements with gomeros in a specific area. Sometimes the organization will supply seed, irrigation hoses, and protection from theft. From the gomeros, the opium gum moves to the wholesalers, who transport it to laboratories for processing. These labs in Mexico are far less sophisticated than those once found in Marseille. A Mexican lab often consists of little more than pots and pans, and the labs are usually operated by chemistry students. The process takes about 3 days. The lab operator receives a fixed fee for processing a kilogram of heroin. Despite the crude conditions, once the process is complete, the value of the heroin skyrockets to between $40,000 and $80,000 per kilogram. Transporting the heroin to the United States border is relatively easy. It is moved by train, car, bus, aircraft, and occasionally by boat across the Gulf of California. The price at the border depends on whether United States or Mexican traffickers are responsible for smuggling it across. Some United States traffickers, seeking to maximize profits, arrange to bring it across the border themselves. Others, unwilling to take the risk, pay a premium for the extra transportation. One popular method is to use female couriers, dividing large quantities of heroin among them. Other traffickers prefer to construct elaborate compartments in cars or other vehicles to smuggle larger amounts. Once again, we encounter the labyrinthine nature of Mexican trafficking. While Mexican officials claim that most major traffickers have been apprehended, United States observers contend that at least 100 individuals in Mexico still head organizations capable of supplying multi-kilogram loads of heroin to the United States. New Orleans is best appreciated while watching rain drip from tropical foliage in a courtyard in the Vieux Carré, the 80-square block area that is its oldest and most iconic part. The city, birthplace of jazz, still pulses after dark as music, now a mix of jazz, rock and country, spills from over 100 doorways along Bourbon Street and its side streets. The restaurants are legendary. Antoine's, the birthplace of Oysters, Rockefeller and Pompano en Papillote, has been serving guests for over 150 years, still run by the founding family. Brennan's, known for its elaborate 7-course breakfast, features dishes like egg St. Charles, poached on fried trout, and strawberries Suzette for dessert. Broussard's is another renowned dining establishment in the French Quarter. Broussard's is operated by Joseph Marcello Jr., the brother of Carlos Marcello, the 5-foot-tall Mafia patriarch whose power in the South, particularly in Louisiana, is far greater than his stature. 5 years ago, Joseph Marcello was initially denied a liquor license for Broussard's by an administrative officer who argued that it was not in the best interest of the community. However, a district judge overruled that decision, and Marcello soon received his license. When Carlos Marcello says he has 200,000 friends in Louisiana, he's probably right, commented Aaron Cohn, who recently retired as the head of the New Orleans Crime Commission and was, for many years, Marcello's most vocal critic. Another New Orleans restaurant, Tony Angelo's, was the scene of a little publicized meeting that typifies the type of connections Cohn criticized. In attendance at that luncheon were Joe DeRosa, a former city councilman who narrowly lost a recent mayoral election by 300 votes and was a candidate for Louisiana Public Service Commissioner; Vincent Bruno, the head of the Police Patrolmen's Association of New Orleans; and Carlos Marcello himself. According to Cohn, reports that Marcello is involved in Mexican heroin trafficking come as no surprise. Marcello's only narcotics-related conviction was for selling marijuana in 1938, but Cohn contends that Marcello has long been associated with some of the nation's most prominent heroin dealers. There's no doubt in my mind he, Marcello, was mixed up in heroin, Cohn says. Federal law enforcement officials are similarly convinced that Marcello continues to back marijuana trafficking. New Orleans sources recall that about 5 years ago, Marcello's associate, Frank Zambito, was indicted on narcotics charges after a World War II bomber crashed in North Carolina while carrying drugs. Zambito fled the country and is believed to be living near Tampico, Tamaulipas. Official sources suspect that Marcello's associates, such as Thomas Amato, also known as Tomats, have made frequent trips to Mexico and Central America that are likely tied to narcotics trafficking. Marcello's relationship with the federal government has been strange, to say the least. Born in Tunisia, Marcello has been under a deportation order since 1953, yet the government has never managed to permanently remove him. Marcello has spent $500,000 fighting deportation, and the government has spent at least $1 million trying to deport him, Cohn remarked. Despite this, in 1975 it was reported that the U.S. Defense Department purchased $1.1 million worth of produce from Pelican Tomato Company, a business with which Marcello has been linked in roles ranging from salesman to public relations man to advisor. Cohn estimates that organized crime activities in New Orleans generate more than $1 billion annually. He and others believe Marcello and his associates have turned the city into an investment hub for mafia organizations from other regions. Law enforcement personnel and others in New Orleans often express frustration at the public's apparent indifference to Marcello's influence. Residents of New Orleans may be so accustomed to the mafia's presence, stretching back over a century, that it feels like a part of the city's fabric. The mafia's influence in New Orleans is at least as old as its influence in any other American city. Public outrage erupted in 1890 when the mafia was bold enough to murder Police Chief David Hennessy in broad daylight while he walked home. Hennessy had been investigating mafia activities when he was fatally wounded by shotgun blasts. Before he died, Hennessy identified his attackers as mafia members. 9 men were brought to trial, but despite a confession from one implicating the others, none were convicted. Members of the defense team were later found guilty of jury tampering. Just 2 days after the acquittal, 61 of the city's prominent residents signed a notice in the newspaper inviting citizens to a mass meeting near the city centre. Led by the city's elite, the mob stormed the jail, where those believed responsible for Hennessy's murder were lynched or shot to death. In recent months, the Gulf Coast has become a major entry point for marijuana shipments. In the Miami area alone, law enforcement personnel seized more than 300 tons of marijuana over a 5-month period, along with 20 large vessels and smaller boats and vehicles too numerous to mention. Cocaine and marijuana are the big things now, a state law enforcement officer said. However, much of the heroin flowing into Florida is Mexican brown heroin, authorities report. Santos Traficante, the longtime mob boss of Tampa, who has a residence in Miami, plays a role in Florida similar to the one Marcello plays in Louisiana. Federal sources in Florida report that 2 of Traficante's narcotics traffickers are Luis Blackie Larandi and Victor Acosta. Larandi is currently serving time in prison. Authorities believe it was Traficante's underboss, Frank D'Esidu, who ordered the murder of retired Tampa Police Sergeant Richard Cloud. Cloud's murder created a stir in Florida, much like the killing of Arizona Republic reporter Don Bolles in Phoenix in 1976. Cloud was believed to have uncovered widespread corruption in Tampa. Benjamin Foy Guilford, a former Baptist minister who pleaded guilty to shooting Cloud, claimed the murder was ordered by Acosta, a convicted cocaine dealer. Other Mexican heroin traffickers in Florida include Carl Fiorito, who has ties to top Chicago syndicate figures, and Sam Cagnina, who is under indictment in Florida for running a criminal organization involved in counterfeiting, forgery, extortion, loan sharking, hijacking, arson, and murder. About a dozen people have been indicted in connection with this operation, and Cagnina is currently being sought by federal authorities. Carlos Marcello, the longtime Mafia kingpin of New Orleans, along with Santos Traficante of Florida, is believed to dictate mob policy for much of the Southeast. Marcello is said to oversee Texans Anthony Catarine and Frank Zambito, and federal authorities report that he obtains heroin from Mexico. Among his past heroin connections is Alberto Cecilia Falcon, a notorious narcotics trafficker who controls drug operations in Mexico and South America. Marcello's role in organized crime stretches back to 1938, when he was convicted of marijuana possession and sales. He paid a fraction of the $76,380 fine and served just 10 months in prison, his only time behind bars. In 1961, he was ordered deported by U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. The government accused Marcello of forging birth records to claim he was born in the United States. Marcello briefly left for Guatemala, but soon returned. Deportation efforts have since become a standing joke in New Orleans law enforcement circles. Just last week, the 1961 deportation order was vacated by U.S. District Judge Jack Gordon, who criticized the Immigration and Naturalization Service for callous disregard for ethical standards. Marcello was charged with conspiracy to defraud the federal government in 1963, but was acquitted. He was indicted in 1964 for bribing a juror and conspiracy to murder a witness. While acquitted of bribery, the conspiracy charge was dropped. In 1966, Marcello was convicted of assaulting a federal officer and sentenced to 2 years in prison, though he only served 6 months in a federal hospital. Marcello has been subpoenaed multiple times, including by a grand jury in Florida in 1977, as part of an investigation into organized crime's influence over the International Longshoremen's Association. That same year, he was also subpoenaed by the House Assassinations Committee in Washington. Among Marcello's associates is Joseph Saladino, who managed the Mexico City-based Producciones Jitomate, and later headed the Pelican Tomato Company in Texas. His brother, Joe Marcello Jr., and his son, Joseph C. Marcello, frequently traveled to Mexico on Carlos Marcello's behalf. Marcello is also connected to Meyer Lansky, a top mob financier, and Harry Clifford Dryden, a known narcotics dealer. Marty Hultin. Marty Hultin calls himself the ace of the drug air force, and federal authorities say the title is well deserved. They estimate Hultin earns about $150,000 a year flying narcotics for anyone who can afford his services when he's not in prison. Hultin is currently serving time on a narcotics conviction. Hultin has long been known to federal authorities. He was once found by narcotics agents sitting in a hotel coffee shop, observing them as they held an air smuggling seminar in Tucson. Authorities believe Hultin has flown substantial amounts of narcotics into the United States for the Chagra brothers, and he was defended by Lee Chagra when he was convicted on his narcotics charge. Victor Statter. Victor Statter, a longtime air smuggler, is a close associate of the Marcello brothers and Texas crime figure Anthony Caterine, according to federal authorities. Statter is believed to be the pilot who flew Carlos Marcello back into the United States after he was deported to Guatemala in 1961. After that flight, Marcello returned to his New Orleans empire, where he managed to evade further deportation attempts. Authorities recently uncovered a plot to have Statter murdered. Statter, who has a history of narcotics smuggling, is said to have criminal connections in Mazatlan and Culiacan in Mexico, as well as in Guatemala, Costa Rica, and Belize. Jimmy Chagra. Jimmy Chagra, brother of Lee Chagra, is widely believed to be his late brother's partner in a narcotics smuggling operation. According to federal authorities, the Chagra brothers have long run a narcotics trafficking ring that brings drugs from Mexico and Colombia into the United States. One of the sources of funding for the Chagra operations is believed to be Tucson Mafia Don Joseph Bonanno Sr. The Chagras used a network of pilots to smuggle drugs across the border. Jimmy Chagra has been living in El Paso, but is reportedly building a home in Las Vegas. Frank J. Zambito. A longtime organized crime figure in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, Frank J. Zambito has played a major role in forging narcotics links between U.S. gangsters and Mexico, according to federal authorities. Zambito was indicted in 1974 for conspiracy to smuggle more than 7 tons of marijuana, but he jumped bail and is believed to be living in Mexico. His last known address was near Tampico, Tamaulipas. Zambito has reportedly met frequently with members of the Marcello Mafia organization, including Carlos Marcello's brother Joseph in Mexico. Zambito also ran a McAllen, Texas, branch of the Pelican Tomato Company, one of whose officers was Marcello subordinate Joe Saladino. Other associates include narcotics trafficker Victor Statter.